Okay.
Okay.
All right. Welcome everybody to this, you know what they say, special edition of so-and-so. This really is a special edition. And I feel as if we're heading into talk show territory because we have a special guest. And not only that, but we're really in talk show territory because we have a special guest who is actually going to talk about his new book, which means that we are absolutely primed for late night TV here. So our guest is Frode Hegland, who is the convener, I'm not sure if that would be the word you would use, of the Future of Text Symposium. He's based in London. Welcome, Frode. And I think what I'd like to do first is to ask you to tell us a little bit about the symposium, and then I'm going to ask you some questions about the collection or anthology that was published, I think, 2 days ago at this point.
Yes, it was. Hello, everyone. It was pre-published 2 days ago on the 54th anniversary of Doug Engelbart's demo. And the reason for that is we had a discussion afterwards. I made a brief presentation, then we had a discussion which the transcript of will also be in the book. So the actual making public will be this coming Friday.
Okay, so tell us a little bit about the symposium.
Yeah, right. There's so many places to start, but if we go back to what I consider probably the beginning, was when I was lucky enough to spend some quality time with Doug Engelbart. I assume in this community, everybody has a rough idea who Doug was?
You know what? I think it wouldn't be a bad idea just to give us a little introduction to Doug and his.
Sure. Very happy to. So Doug Engelbart was a descendant of the guy who wrote the Norwegian national anthem. So he has some strong Norwegian roots. He grew up in Oregon, not a very well-off family. He was the kind of, as he said, farm kid who went to school in dirty shoes, and that's his origin. He was clever, so he went to Berkeley and all kinds of places, and everything was mapped out. He was working at the forerunner of NASA, so driving to work in the morning one day, which is actually, anyway, I'm not going to waste your time with specific dates. We just had a bit of an update in the community about them, but anyway, he visualized his future as being a long corridor with very many obvious things, career advancement, probably getting married, having kids, all of that stuff. And he got really stressed by this. So he decided he's going to spend some time to invest into the question of how can he get the best return on his investment in his career for humanity. He was always a big thinker. He then figured out how many millions of minutes he would have in his working life. I think it was just something like 4 million we have. So, puts it in perspective. And he went through a period of time around Christmas time, like now, wondering what giant thing should he try to do, what crusade, a word he would later come to hate using because of its historic roots. He looked at this, that, and the other, the great quote unquote men of history, what do they do? And he found it all very unsatisfactory because there was always complications. And the last one he really looked at was a fantastic project to deal with malaria somewhere in Africa. I can't remember what country. They managed to reduce the malaria by draining the swamp, and the result was less malaria death, but a lot more starvation. So that was just so horrible that he one day just said, these are urgent, complex problems. We need to figure out how to deal with urgent, complex problems. And he decided to devote his life to helping us deal with urgent, complex problems. Hence, what he came to do, which was when he was in the Navy, he was a radar technician, and he had read one book on computers, giant brains. And he just said, hang on a second, why don't we take a keyboard in front of a radar monitor and hook it up to a computer? So that pretty much started with him. Kind of a long time ago. And he started a long path, first writing a paper in 1962, which I would highly recommend that you read or at least skim. Worked at SRI, lots of politics, people never really getting what he did. And then in 1968, he managed to get a big investment from DARPA to put together a demo of what this stuff was. So that's where he first showed to the world a screen with a computer keyboard and a mouse, word processing, outline processing, and several things we don't have today, such as being able to draw a map on screen, like let's say where you're going to go to do your shopping. And each point was basically a hyperlink to information about that point. Very powerful views. He also had a video conferencing going in 1968. It cost a huge amount of money and it was microwave. The internet wasn't quite up for it then. Actually, it wasn't quite anything then, of course. So that was Doug. Doug dedicated his career to augmenting human intellect. And there are many philosophical implications to that. I'm happy to talk about that today or at any other time. Point is that my background is I was studying advertising, Mac versus PC time, early 90s, late 80s. One day, upstate New York, I realized they're both shit when it comes to augmenting, or I didn't use that term, didn't know that term, to helping us think. So I decided then, okay, I'm going to spend some time defining information for myself. And that took about 6 months to figure out what information is. And I defined it simply as something which is useful to someone in some way at some point. Because different disciplines, of course, have very different ideas of information. I then, at the same time, developed a philosophy which is based on the notion of liquid information. We should be able to interact with information in fluid ways. Having done that, that's when I decided, okay, I know the Mac really well. I know what Windows is. What was before? And this is really key, I think, to where we are today with virtual reality. What was before? You know, I was completely brainwashed on the Mac. So that's when I picked up Howard Rheingold's Tools for Thoughts. That's when I learned about Doug and Ted and all these other people. And that's how later on I called Doug's office and, you know, we became friends and to an extent collaborators. It's very hard to collaborate with Doug because his ideas are very strong. And no matter what you do, it's always wrong. And a deep and positive level, he said, that is very good and useful, but that is your thing, it's not my thing. So fair enough. But that was really the beginning of a lot of this.
Did you feel a little bit like Dr. Watson to Doug Sherlock Holmes?
That's a really good question, and the answer is absolutely no. Because I came to him with my own fully fledged philosophy. Of course, having no track record or anything, this guy literally changed our world. But I felt that his philosophy was larger than mine, so mine kind of slotted into it. So that's why I was happy to just learn from him openly. The Sherlock Watson analogy would be that the Watson person would be more practical and get things done. I'm not a particularly practical person. I didn't help him necessarily get a lot done. But thank you for the very fancy question, nevertheless.
Okay, so thanks for the background. As I understand it, the Future of Text Symposium has been running now for several years. And the collection that is coming out, that has just come out, that is about to just come out, is the third collection. Is that right?
Yes. Yes, that's right.
So can you talk a little bit about, so these are all essays or articles that are submitted by members of your group or contacts of them. Can you talk a little bit about what some of these articles are about?
Yeah, hang on. I'm just going to try to get you a list of who is on there. 1 second. Yeah, I can talk a little bit about that. Of course, you're very, very free to get the preview of the book yourself. But I think the most important thing to say about this book is that most of what's in there is a clear display of ignorance. And I think that's very, very important. And I don't say that in a derogatory manner. What I mean is, you know, when Doug started doing what he did, there was nothing in the world, so to speak, of digital text. There was a little bit at MIT doing a thing on this and that, but there wasn't anything anybody could sit down and use. So the mind was not clouded by current paradigms, but it was also incredibly hard to dream what it might be. You know, Doug was a dreamer, and dreaming really is hard work. Today, we're in a similar position, I think. I believe very strongly that at least within 5 years, most people who would use a computer today will have a headset, VR, XR, AR, whatever it is going to be called, whatever mode you will use it, we will have it. I take that as a complete given. So I've been using, even invested tons of money in this, the Quest Pro, and it has many benefits and many really bizarre detriments. But what I found over the year working with people, including people well placed in industry and academia with deep knowledge of this stuff, is that we really don't know what working in VR is or should be. So what I've been begging people all year, because what's in the book, there's articles, there's transcript from the symposium, like you said, which has been running for 11 years now. And it's also, we have, roughly speaking, monthly guest presentations, like we're having fun with today here, that are also transcribed. So that's the content of the book. So I've been asking people all year, what do we want working in VR to be? And the amount of ignorance is staggering. And I talk for myself as well. I consider myself a creative person. My background is that of an artist, Chelsea School of Art, that good stuff. Normally I'd be able to do this, that, and the other. But to think in an infinite space, it's actually really, really hard. And what some of the current conclusions at the end of the year are is basically, if we can just work with rectangular screens in a flexible way in VR or AR, I see it as almost the same thing. Obviously, VR, you don't see the world. AR, you do, obviously, but like in the Quest, you just tap on the side and you get passed through. So that's why I'm saying it's two modes of the same thing. So I think we need to start really, really basic with very little imagination just to get something going, because right now to work on these devices is quite kludgy. And at the same time think. But what I have kind of pushed people over the year is to write all their nonsense down, including my own, of what we think, so that in the future, because this is 2022, Apple's headset is coming next year. And I believe that Apple, as they usually do, they will own the interactions. So in about 2 years, everybody will do whatever the Apple headset. You will do a this to copy and a that to that. If they will own that. I think that's incredibly scary. So that's why I've been collecting viewpoints for how we should do it. Just so that, let's say, a young person, even in 10 years, can look back and find this, oh, there were some people thinking about this when it didn't exist. And let's not forget, this is the last point in human history. We're living in a knowledge world where we don't use deeply immersive headset part of the time. It's never going to be like this ever again.
Interesting. So one of the things I would like to do is what we did last time when I was talking with Olesh, and Olesh invited everybody to step in and insert comments and questions as we go, rather than leaving them until the end, because I think that so much that comes up right now is going to provoke questions and comments that waiting till the end may turn out to be confusing and frustrating. So please, to everybody, feel free to jump in. I'm going to carry on asking questions because this is what I do, but I wouldn't want you to think that that means that you shouldn't. Okay, so tell me, when you talk about the future of text, in what sense are you using the word text?
Very, very, to make a pun, literally. I really mean characters, symbols on a background. Doug referred to symbol manipulation, and that's where we had a huge overlap in our passion for what this stuff can do. As I mentioned, I come from an art background, so doing videos and photography is something, like I put something on Instagram today, some stupid little video I took on the tube, and I said, I can't not film. So I come from that perspective, but I feel that if you want software for that, you have Final Cut from Apple. It's insanely amazing. Adobe has a series of incredible pieces of software, but there hasn't been any real innovation in text in the last 20 years, other than the web link, spell check, and I really like the tap back in messages. Of course, at the second half of this year, we really started seeing AI generated text, and that's an entirely new thing. But that's not really the text that's the key. It's the stuff that makes the text happen that's new. And considering that now for eons, depending on how you look at the evolution of this thing, we've been developing text, and it's helped us in so many ways. And I assume you guys are here because you have a strong passion for what text can do to augment us. It's being completely ignored. I mean, when's the last, if you're a Mac user, when's the last update to Pages? Windows or Mac user, what's Microsoft Word done for us lately? So even though we go into many areas, and I really don't mind if someone has, for instance, Bob Horn in our book talks a lot about the murals. We have actually put his murals into a VR environment, and they do have text on them, but also a lot of graphics. Of course, that's complementary and important. So I'm not saying text only on a page, but primarily text.
And of course, I will have a question.
Yes, of course you will.
My question would be, you said the manipulation of symbols on some kind of layout, right? But those symbols, what do they represent? Because this is a question we've been pondering and quarreling about in our research group about. It's called sign and symbol. It's working on actually on understanding writing systems. And what would the text mean for you? Would that be connected directly to speech, to language, parole, langue, whatever? What do you see as a text, or just a sequence of symbols, or layout of symbols?
I'm very happy to give me my perspective on that, but could you, I don't know most of you, could you give me like a 10-second introduction of where you are and
Yes,
what your interests are?
Sure. My name is Olger. I am teacher of Chinese language and researcher in Warsaw University, and I work with the sign and symbol research group, to which you are immediately invited if you can participate or to give a lecture to us. We'll be really glad. And we work on different writing systems from Mayan through Egyptian via Chinese, ancient Chinese and modern Chinese, and comparative studies. And I'm also a happy member of Endangered Alphabets community.
Fantastic, that was very useful. So to answer that, a little bit more concept about me. As I said, I'm a very creative person, and that's not to big myself up or anything, but that is my leaning in the world. I'm also not very good at more hardcore things. It's certainly not compliment to myself. But now that I'm in the role of being a bit of an editor of the book and so on, it's there are two strands I have to support. One of them is I don't care what you talked about. That's one of them, meaning that whatever symbols we have available, what are the tools and processes we can employ to help us clearer communicate and to more critically read? That's one half of it. And my software, Author and Reader, both for Mac, unfortunately, only for Mac, are based around a student authoring to a teacher and a teacher or academic reading. That's the model, no matter who's reading or writing. So that is just accepting text at whatever language you're using to write. That's it. Now, on the other side of it is the deep dreaming. And that's where what you're talking about is really, really exciting. And I would absolutely like to support it, almost like a separate strand. Because if we can improve symbols, I think we can do incredible things for humanity. Because the way you talked about it was really beautiful to hear. No, I don't think the written word is just speech. Absolutely not. No, I'm not a big fan of either the rebus principle or of Asian writings. My family is part Japanese, so that I have some emotional connection to that, but that's not really my focus. What is interesting about that is there isn't much looking at the beautiful questions you just posed that I have seen. For instance, there are still people who sometimes talk about just plain text. I try to point out there's no such thing as plain text. Text has to be rendered in a typeface, even if it's a monospace on an old screen, it's still rendered somehow.
Thank you.
Similarly, a line break has semantic meaning. It may not have the intended meaning, but these things really mean something for different worlds. So to have an in-depth dialogue around, how can we place symbols on a substrate? What is a substrate? and what are symbols? How can they relate? And how can they carry an author's intention as cleanly as possible? And how can we interrogate that? There are such interrelated questions, and I think that for the future of our species, we need to address them. Because right now, we are obviously dealing with a lot of speech, which on many levels, and by speech, I mean all forms, including writing, which have very strong agendas, which are not that.
It's very interesting that you should be talking about symbols on a substrate, because actually one of the things that I was writing some stuff about last night was the relationship between the physical act of writing and the physical substance on which the writing takes place. So, for example, in Indonesia, especially in northern Indonesia, traditionally charms were written on buffalo horn. And it struck me as being ridiculous to assume that the only reason they were using buffalo horn was because it had a suitable texture, for example, or it would take the imprint of a sharp instrument. The relationship between the act of writing and the buffalo horn surely takes in many of the qualities of how the buffalo was seen and thought of. And so what you have is a kind of interparticipation between the act of writing and the substrate on which you're writing. And this is something that I see all the time when I'm carving text, because to carve something in wood is a completely different act, and it produces a completely different product than to write something on paper.
I think that is absolutely phenomenally important. And since I'm 99% digital, it makes me a bit jealous to hear about that. But that the substrate has such a life, even if it's non-interactive, is really beautiful. And I can see what you're talking about. Obviously, in a horror movie, you might write on somebody, that's happened. But the more subtle aspects of that are really, really fascinating. And in our Future of Text community, every Monday and Friday, and you're all very, very welcome, just send me a message. One of the things we talk about is how we can maybe make discourse more thoughtful. And my perspective on that is chat and live and all of that is great, but I also want more document-based discourse. That's why I've developed this metadata system where documents can cite each other rather than have to deal with these temporary web servers and DOIs and all of that nonsense. And part of that is the speed at which you write as well. And if you get to write in your own environment where you control simple things like the font and the size, is very different from logging into someone else's world and following their aesthetics, their breaks, their rhythms.
This is wonderful, because one of the other things I was writing about the other day was what I call the unit of resistance. So this comes from a friend of mine. This is back in the 1980s, who was a very, very good short story writer and poet. And he had always wanted to write novels, but writing a novel is such a different order of challenge that he had never done it successfully. And when the first PCs came in, he got one, I think, in '84, so it was pretty early. He immediately sat down and wrote the novel that he'd always dreamed of writing. And he sent it to his publisher down in Boston, and his publisher invited him to come down to Boston. And so he went down, and the publisher invited him out on a boat, I think maybe a rowing boat or a canoe, on a lake somewhere in central Massachusetts. And when they were out in the middle of the lake, the publisher said to my friend, David, not only am I not going to publish your novel, I'm going to do my best to persuade you not to submit it to anybody else. And what had happened was that when you're writing really short forms and when there are challenges on your time, you do a great deal of thinking and a relatively small amount of writing. What I call the unit of resistance is very high. I used to write when I was driving, for example. And so I literally could die if I tried to write everything that I was thinking. And so I would write these tiny little fragments anytime there was a straight stretch of road. And the result was very poetic, and it meant that I had really put a great deal into it. So eventually my friend got off the rowing boat and went back and trashed his novel. And unfortunately, he then forgot that advice and went ahead and started writing novels, which I think are not nearly as good as his short stories and poetry. So I think this issue of the belief that the purpose of our tools is to reduce the element of resistance is almost a guaranteed way of ensuring that we are not accessing the best of what we have to offer. And in fact, it's the inconvenience of the medium that often produces the best of our response.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Just writing notes here. Really fantastic, because obviously one of the things coming up next year will be GPT-3 and other things will become normalized, or at least over the next few years. So I know that OpenAI have tools to help people assess whether what has been written has been produced by their systems. So teachers have a little bit, but when it comes to, it sounds like it's completely relevant to what you said, but what I'm thinking is very often in academia and other writing, even university level academia or high school, you have to write a ton of words. And I think that's really, really stupid, because once you get good at typing or speech to text, you can just put whatever nonsense out, do some editing, you're done. Brevity in the way you're talking about is fantastically important. Now, to talk about it in a way of resistance, I think you should maybe change the terminology, because it's actually so positive what you're saying. Because it's a different kind of resistance. It's like when you go lie down on a mattress, you don't want it to be too soft, right?
Right.
You can't really sell it on being too hard either. I think you're talking about something really, really important. Now, I'm not really addressing what's in chat because I'm focusing on what's being said. I just saw two things, but I put in the chat as well. Next year, okay, so we have 3 volumes. We're doing one next year. The first one was just the Future of Text, and we subtitled it a 2020 vision because it was 2022. Excuse me, it was 2020. So that was cute. Next year, we decided to do one anyway, so that became a second vision. The third book that we're just releasing now, we jokingly call the Future of Text in 3D, because over the year we have almost exclusively focused on VR and AR. And the reason for that, just to really bring it home, I want the publication date to be the year before the Apple headset. So in the future, when people look for what was before it, this will be one of the resources for all these wonderful people who put out the effort. Next year, it'll be volume 4, and it'll be academic text. Not just higher level, but all kinds of academic text. And one of the things I think we need to get to is to help students write shorter essays. So what you're talking about there really fits so well, because what teacher has time to read these long, silly essays, right? It's a real drain. But how do we manage to upgrade so that we increase the quality and decrease the length? The notion of resistance is, yeah, very interesting.
Anybody else want to jump in here? I feel as if I'm monopolizing the questioning.
I would like as well. Notion of resistance and notion of the way you write. I would like to remind you the way that Chinese works, and Japanese too, is that funny little thing in ancient times they were using kind of augmented reality. When you put your hand, you put your finger, and you write a character in your hand, and you communicate quite well between Japanese, Chinese and Cantonese. And this is kind of interesting from another point of view, because it has been functioning in culture for, it's called like the bihua, speaking with the pen. Although it is no present, pen present. You just use your hands. And I actually use it with my students when I teach Chinese, when we write Chinese characters. At the beginning, we start writing them on simply in the air, because you can easily distinguish the way it is written and what is written. And you see the mistakes easily because they're large and they are very in your face, literally.
Literally. Have you seen the movie Hero?
Yes.
I saw it with Ted Nelson.
Yes. And that's another practice I do. We write with the mop on the ground.
You know who Ted Nelson is, right? He coined the term hypertext. So when he was in London many years ago, my brother and I took him to the movies randomly, and we saw Hero. For those of you who don't know, it's about martial arts and calligraphy. And there's a bit of politics behind it, but it's just so beautiful. You have to see it. So the notion of writing like that, writing on no substrate, so to speak, is really, really interesting. I mean, Doug Engelbart developed the chorded key set. So with one hand, you could write all the characters and numbers. And his daughters, they learned that. So in school, to communicate with each other in class, they'd actually make the finger shapes. So they would read the finger shapes of each other. So very related to what you're saying.
And think about the magic things that you can do with the wand or with the hand, just working with it in the air. It's actually, again, of the same idea.
Of course, it goes against one of the principles of the value of text, which is its durability. But it certainly doesn't make it less interesting. Sorry, my wife just brought me coffee. I asked for coffee with milk, and she did that. Isn't that cute? Very, very grateful. Yeah. So actually, at this point, if you don't mind, can we talk about metadata a little bit?
Go for it.
Okay. So I am finishing my PhD now. I handed up in my thesis a year ago, and then I had my viva last summer, which was horrible, really brutal, but apparently I got through it. Supposed to be doing corrections, but there's some admin issues. But my PhD was originally, well, it is in computer science, but it was originally from a visual and graphical point of view, because I have that kind of background. So I hoped I could do something amazing with citation flows and all of that stuff. And then I found out quite quickly that the data is not available. This was quite shocking. I found out that...
Sorry, which data is not available?
The data to allow to build a citation tree, for instance.
Ah, okay.
Right, so I couldn't just go to ACM and say I want everything on the proceedings of hypertext or whatever. It's just not there. So I found out that the practice in academia at that level is to use a reference manager or something. And reference manager, for those of you who are not used to them, and I hope none of you are because they're awful, they're basically databases. You can drag in a PDF and it'll try to extract the metadata of citation information. Or you can refer to things you don't actually own by just having that data in there. So the metadata is in a database, and the data, the PDF or whatever it might be, is just kind of linked to these two things. So, I just saw the chat message, this exactly. So the relevance here is that, first of all, there was the question in my viva about, no, I'm going ahead of myself. What I decided to do was to figure out a way to put metadata into PDF. And that sounds like a solved problem, but it's not. You can, of course, embed in a PDF using XMP and all kinds of weird wrappers, the title of the document, the author name, and the publication date. But hardly anyone does it because it's really convoluted in doing it. It's not the same as on a Mac doing Command-I and typing in author. So that means that all of these academic documents are essentially dumb. You can't just expect a computer system to know anything about them. So the question my external advisors wanted to know, I said, I'm still getting ahead of myself. So my solution to this was very simple. At the end of the document, in the format of BibTeX, you write what the document is. So for instance, if you want to write the author name, you write author equals and then the name, title equals, really simple. human readable, and parsable by computer. So that means that if the system that opens this PDF can read this, what we call visual meta, it can automatically allow you to cite just by copy and paste. So that's already a big thing. There are three categories of metadata in this system. One is how you cite the document. One is the structure of the document, which is headings. And finally, how it's connected to the rest of the world, which is the citations from that document. All of this stuff is in a normal manuscript, but when it goes for publication, it's usually dropped out. So here was the thing, I keep jumping ahead of myself. One of them asked, if the information is in the document at the same level as the rest of the text, is it still metadata? I think that's a valid question. And one of my research subjects for this was also coincidentally Ted Nelson. And he said he doesn't believe in the notion of metadata. He believes that all data is data. And here's the conclusion for why I'm giving you this long speech on metadata. And that is, metadata is the data which says what data is, such as this text here is the name of the author. So therefore, it is absolutely gold dust. And that's why it's so important to include it in the document. I really don't think we can afford to keep going on with dumb documents. They have to have the smarts, they have to be self-referential, they have to be able to say how they relate to the universe and so on. I think that some of the earlier comments here also touch on the notion of metadata in a longer discussion. So that's why I'm bringing it up now.
So to connect that with something we were talking about earlier, and also a subject that Olesh and I and several people here have been talking about for some time, which is the traditional distinction between writing and graphic symbols, and how we believe that that's a false and shallow distinction. But I decided to bring a visual aid along to the talk today. So the first time I saw writing on clothing, not a tag, but just visible writing, was when I was hitchhiking through America in 1973, and I was in Berkeley actually, and I bought a sweatshirt because I had never seen a sweatshirt with the name of a university on it before, and I thought it was ridiculously cool. Plus the fact that Berkeley was the coolest place in the world in 1973 anyway. It strikes me that one of the interesting transitions that's taking place right now is a convergence or a reconvergence of writing and graphic symbol. And so what I have brought along today as an example of this is the Endangered Alphabets t-shirt. So here we have something which is, we have some sort of standard writing in English. We have a graphic symbol that was designed by Alec, who is actually part of the group today and is our engineer and producer, and also the graphic designer for the Endangered Alphabets. But the symbol itself is actually based on the Manchu word for heaven. And as you were talking, Frode, about this business of metadata, it occurred to me that at the moment, we have no ability to assess and discuss the relationship between what we think of as a graphic symbol and what we think of as a written symbol. Somebody who is a graphic designer instinctively understands what works together, what kinds of balance and symmetry, what the interaction between these various components is, but we don't have a language to discuss that in textual terms, because our discussion of text is so much based on writing and graphics as being two different fields.
Oh God, there's so much meat. And so, yeah, on what you're talking about, it comes down to, obviously, partly in a digital domain, the availability of authoring tools. a little bit, but also the ability to express yourself richly requires you to have a rich control set. And that will have to come from, generally, I would say, some kind of training and knowledge of the tools. As I said, my background is visual. I can make a movie and all of this stuff is quite easy for me. But a lot of people who say text is really boring, it's all going to be movies, they don't know how to edit or film the most basic movie. So it becomes very hypothetical. So I agree with what you're talking about very much. And I think somebody asked me, a friend, if I'm an elitist, and in this sense I am. We should all aim to be more skilled at the work that we do, for sure. And that is why it is important that these textual environments allows us more expressive power. My own are weak in that. And that's really down to, it's expensive to make these things. But it is a really important point you're making.
I would say that it's I don't think it's that elitist. If you take into consideration what we're seeing, for example, in online communication, people are doing, they're incorporating every kind of communication into one message. It is now in a linear way, sequential, but if you look at the way it is graphically analyzable, you've got determinatives, emotional determinatives, graphic determinatives, you've got moving parts that are meaningful, and they're all incorporated in one text, which is actually a text.
What community did you say? I couldn't hear you. What community?
No, just people that are communicating on Messenger, on WeChat, online. You are able to include in the text.
Oh yeah,
almost any kind of graphic. It is now in a linear form. But if you look at talking about metadata, I always recall my friend Alexandra Peinado. She researches Japanese, and she analyzed the translation of Good Dr. Korczak, is one of the heroes of Holocaust in Poland. And in the Japanese translation, they had Japanese characters, and the furigana under them was giving the Polish or Yiddish terms that the Japanese text was translating, just as a furigana within the text. So it's like the attempt of metadata in a way.
Yeah, that's a good point. I see here in the text chat, and I'm really trying not to read, but you guys are writing too much interesting stuff. This thing about, where was it now? On aphorisms and all that good stuff and poetry. I came across a notion recently that I'm not afraid to admit that I learned only recently, and that is the difference between what's called high context and low context cultures, because the discussion here in chat is about clarity. And what was explained to me was in a low context culture, such as in the US and the UK, when you communicate, there is very little expectation that the other party knows what you're talking about. So that's why we have things like advice saying, tell them what you're going to tell them, and tell them what you told them. So an example would be, let's have lunch on Friday. In that culture, maybe let's have lunch on Friday at 1 p.m. at this place. But in a high context culture, which is more Central European, let's say, they find that very arrogant, and it's like, why are you talking down to me? You've already said this or already know this. And so an example would be, let's have lunch on Friday. Yeah, good idea. Because there's an expectation you're going to meet, you have lunch at 1. You usually go to a restaurant. So that was such a big surprise to me. I actually saw it on a TikTok, believe it or not. Huh. And it just made so many cultural weirdnesses in my own experience clear. So to see the difference between poetry here and what, Alec, what you're saying, clear communication, is really, really interesting.
I have to admit, this is something that Oleś, this is maybe a question for you. Something that I don't understand about Chinese, because I don't speak or read and write Chinese, I only know what I have read about it. But my understanding is that the relationships between characters are not conventionally linear in the sense that we write in the Latin alphabet, but also that there is a kind of accumulation or accretion of associative meaning from character to character, rather than a literal sense that you're kind of adding a one word onto another, like cars on a freight train. So that notion of sort of high context would seem to apply more there. Can you tell me more about this? Because, as I say, I really don't know much about it.
Just to make it clear and short, is when you have a character and you want to communicate, you can either use it in a way that simply gives you what was spoken, and this is character in a linear way, sequentially put. And then if you're talking about poetry, more high context, right? Then you can also take into consideration semantical elements that are suggested by the elements of the character. And they may be connected in just any way. You've got, for example, somebody wants to give you an imaginary grass, and they will use characters that have an element grass that are not necessarily semantically in any way as a part of speech connected to grass, but they're graphically connected to grass. So we've got graphical communication overlapping with the verbal communication. That's, well, something that is a way more difficult. But if you read comic books, it's not impossible in European alphabetic writing. We do it with the font. We do it with the context of the font, the way the letters look, lettering, and so on.
And the colors. Huh. Okay, other questions? We've got about 10 minutes left, and I have a feeling that we're going to be like chewing on all of this for a long time to come. So throw your questions in now while you can.
Actually, can I show you something?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll try to make it really quick. But you have to enable screen share.
Oh yeah, so hang on just a second. Okay, I'm making you a co-host so you can screen share now.
Can do, right. So I'm just going to go to my software author. I'm currently, these are all trade secrets here, writing down author for VR, because I actually plan to do that. That's all very exciting. But at the bottom of the screen, you can see I have write/map. If I click, well, the way it works is this. In anywhere I am, I can do Command D to define. And now put my own name in, for instance. So I am doing a defined term, defining, in this case, my name, and I'm going to make myself a person. Why not? So that's done, and I now click to the map view. And persons are in italic, just because it looks like a signature. And this is all that I bothered put together. But the point of it is, this is an intentional manual way of doing it. So if I click on write, I can do Command D to get the definition. But if I now point to the line, it tells me why they're connected. Oh, I have it in caps as well. That's a bit of a mistake. So you can see here how that goes, right? And here you can see there are two thin lines and one bold line. The bold one is going from, that means that my name, Frode Hegland, is in the definition of author. These other ones indicate that they have something that points to that. And that's it, that's the whole system. The reason I wanted to show you that is, we're going to maybe try to have a larger view for that in VR, and it's all very exciting and so on. But you asked very early on in the discussion today about what these symbols represent, and are they voice, and are they so on. What we're trying to experiment with is just different ways to put stuff of meaning and value in different places. It's not really spatial hypertext, but there are experiments where the output from this would be a glossary in a PDF. So it's very traditional. Of course, that glossary is interactive, but that's another 15 minutes of discussion. I'm not going to waste your time. But the point is, this is to help someone who is writing something to click around and say, have I missed something? Or Is this relationship correct?
So that I have to say that was extraordinarily helpful, showing that that graphic, and it made me realize that when writing was superseded, at least in part, by printing, then our whole notion of what writing contains was artificially limited by giving the impression that these parallel lines of text were all that there was to be found in writing. And what that graphic shows is that all of the other elements that might have been included in the thinking have essentially been left out by the limitations of the technology. But we're so used to that technology that we forget that all of that stuff is actually there, but just not well represented.
I'm so grateful for the way you phrased that and for your enthusiasm and the way you picked that up. At the Future of Text Symposium in September, Fabien Beneteau, who does VR for the European community or something, anyway, super amazing guy, he pointed out that with VR, we're really just recapturing space. We used to work on a whole desk and a wall and everything. And then we started ending up doing only tiny rectangles, which is insane. Now we're going back into that. And we can have that space be magic. So for you to highlight what you said there, it is such an obvious thing, which is wonderful, that we have been really conditioned to work in gray columns of text, and it's insane. It really is. So every time you get a capability, that capability is constrained, no matter what it is. One thing that irks me more than anything is Elon Musk, who is clearly a financial genius, but I'm not sure about the other parts, talking about human brain interfaces. Look at this. Our brains have such incredible finesse with our hands, right? If we're just going to straight think that, it's still going to have to go through an interface. But if we use what we have to be able to enable the kind of things you're talking about, to really have that richness of getting things together, it's really, really important.
It's amazing you should say that, because literally last night I posted an essay I wrote called "Elon Musk Was Wrong" about his human to human brain interface thing, and how there are so many elements involved in the act of writing that are actually really valuable in the process of communication. And you can tell that's clearly the case because, so if you go back in science fiction history, in other words, you think about futurism in the 1930s, the assumption was that writing would disappear. Everybody would have these watches on their wrists that were actually video communicate. Exactly, right? And in Star Trek, nobody ever writes anything. They always have video communications, etc. But when we got to the point in history where we could actually do that, what happened? People started texting each other. There are good reasons why people don't want immediate and intimate communication with each other. People want to be able to think about it. People want to be able to maintain a certain degree of anonymity, right? So, and in fact, the same generation that got those smartphone devices that could have acted like that, they don't use the phone anymore because it's too immediate. They would much rather use writing because of its ability to create a small amount of distance between themselves and whoever it is they're writing to. So I think this is, it's sort of fascinating how everything in this conversation is starting to come together.
Yeah, I was thinking, sorry, Tim, for coming immediately after you. Without letting Frode intervene first, but I read your essay yesterday. I was lucky enough to be on the phone, and the algorithm suggested it, and I wrote it. I read it, sorry, and I was thinking of what Indigo was writing a bit ago, that sometimes we get back to manual writing because for some reason this way of handwriting it's like if it transferred thought in a different way from our mind to paper or to our hand or whatever, than if we do it on a computer. So I use several ways of writing. If I'm writing for translation, I do it on the computer because it's more productive. But if I'm writing for myself, for my own thoughts, be it my own organization or my agenda, or even my personal finance, I do it by hand because I feel it's closer to me. And I could do it on Excel for my personal finance. I have a Google Agenda to organize myself, but I like scratching it and using the everything I can do it by hand. And it feels different. And maybe that's one of the keys. As I'm speaking to you, today I feel like I didn't understand anything you said. I'll watch the record later because my mind is like, and I feel more ignorant than at the beginning, but maybe that's good because I can start thinking a different way. But maybe feelings are something we have to consider more when it comes to writing, because we are human beings. In our purpose of life is simply living. And sometimes when we think of writing, we only think about tools. Okay, now we will write by hand. Now we will write by computer. Now we will use a headset or whatever. But what are you feeling? Why are you writing? What's your human nature when writing? Because I start to feel anxious and fearful when thinking about all these technologies. Sometimes it's just what you said. I don't want to share my thoughts outside. I don't want to use a computer. I don't want to use a headset. I just want to stay on my own thinking and writing on a piece of paper. So those are just some thoughts, because my brain is burning right now. It's writing things all over there in the space. And thank you for the wonderful discussion.
This is great. I'm going to send out, I'm going to email everybody this mini chapter that I just wrote for my book, which is actually about writing with pencil and how, I won't say anymore. I'll send it out to you, and I will very much look forward to hearing your thoughts and responses. Well, this has been epic. What fun. Frode, I'm so glad that you come at this from a somewhat different background and different direction than I do, and than some of the other people in our group, because you've really helped stir things up and make connections that otherwise we wouldn't have seen. Just to say one other thing, there's a bunch of stuff also on chat. Right at the very top of chat, I put a link to a Radio Lab program. A great episode about, it's called The Wubby Effect, about attempts attempts by the Chinese government to make Chinese typable more quickly, and all sorts of very strange and odd and interesting things that came out of that. And Frode has also put in the link to the preprint of the Future of Text 3. That's about a third of the way down the chat. Then there's a whole bunch of other things there. So we'll certainly look forward to making the chat available. And yes, Frode, go ahead.
I'm sorry, I can't let you go without the pen. We got to talk about the pen for a second. Do we have another minute? Okay. So I like to read on paper, believe it or not. One thing I like to do is do my own underlines, much more human than block, right? So what we built into Author, because of the software APIs Apple makes available, is that if I take a picture of any analog book, so that, you know, I made some notes there, whatever, when I then open it in Photos, then because of Apple's live text, I can actually select the text in the photograph. If I just copy that into Author as a citation, Author will actually go online, find the book based on the text in the book, and create a citation for it, which is mind-blowing. I mean, we did the tiny bit, Apple did the big thing. But the reason I'm saying it is we absolutely must develop digital ways to deal with a pen. Do it on paper, but later on, the workflow to get it digital just has to be stronger, because the affordances, the emotion, the expressiveness is so different, and that is really, really important.
Look at what I'm doing right now. I'm taking notes by hand. It would be so much more productive. Yeah, that's it. It would be so much more productive to do it on computer, or maybe it would be even more logical to do it watching the recording and writing it calmly on the other computer, but it doesn't feel the same. And I feel less anxious when I'm taking notes here that I will never read, which happens a lot of times, because I'm not understanding anything, but at least I'm taking notes, and that's an activity, and it releases my stress, you know, and there's something about it, and I haven't found anything similar in digital.
I would like to invite you guys, whoever would like to, our Monday and Friday chats. As you said, I come in with a different perspective here. You would come in with a different perspective there. What you're talking about, I would say, comes from a more humanist rather than let's make a program or let's do it academic. I would be so grateful to continue this conversation, and I'd love to come back here whenever there's an opportunity. So it's supposed to be Sunday, not Sunday. Which day is it? Yeah, it is Sunday. Whatever. It's weekend. It's rest. It's been a stressful weekend. But I'm so grateful for you, all of you, for your incredible different perspectives and open minds. Very, very grateful to be here. So Tim, just thank you very, very much.
Wonderful. Alec is going to save me the list of registrants and the chat, and I will send and the link to the recording, which he is so efficient, he usually gets up the same day. So I will send that out to all of you. I know that I'm going to be going back over this and stealing stuff and taking notes as well in my analog way. This has been great. So this is the last one of 2022. I wish you all a wonderful holiday season, great time with families such as you're able to. Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
One last thing, I promise. If any of you have a single thought on working with text in VR, you send it me today or by midday tomorrow. I'll put it in the book. We have a section in the book that are really brief thoughts. So if you have anything, especially from your perspective, oh my God, I would be so grateful for it. And I will shush and thank you.
All right.
Okay,
great.
But what's your email, or will Tim send us your email?
It's in the chat. It's in the chat.
Ah, okay.
Frode@hegland.com is the easiest one, because that's just my name.
Okay, great. Well, and also I hope 2023 is kind to all of you, to all of us. Things in the end of 2020, I sent out these greetings, which are, let's hope 2021 is the year we all hoped 2020 would be, but really wasn't. Anyhow, so I hope 2023 is the year you all hope 2022 would be. Thanks so much. I'm going to stop recording now, and from now on we'll communicate by other tools and processes. Take care, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.